Just finished my reread of Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. This is a reread. I originally read it, I don't remember, in 2008 or 2009. It was right before the movie came out. And I've reviewed the movie on this channel before. I'll link to my video review of the movie in the description down below. By the way, I've just realized that for years I've been referring to the movie and the comic book as The Watchmen, where actually it's just Watchmen, no the. So apologies for any previous videos or blog posts I've done on this in which I've called it The Watchmen. That's a little bit of an embarrassing mistake, but there you go. It's Watchmen, no the, by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. So this is probably the most talked about graphic novel of all time. Certainly the most critical ink has been spilled over this, I think, of any other graphic novel. And there is a lot to talk about. There are a lot of layers in here. And I'm going at this unscripted, so I'm just going to be spewing up ideas as they come to me. I've got a rough idea of points I want to talk about, but no script or no outline. So as always, I'm probably going to make a mess of it, but I take some solace in the fact that there are so many think pieces on Watchmen out there that even if I make a mess of this or don't talk about half the things that I could talk about, somebody else will undoubtedly have covered all these points anyways. So I'm just going to dive in and give my impressions of this. I guess maybe a point to talk is just going through my own history of this. I was a bit of a Johnny-come-lately to the Watchmen fandom. I was not really aware of this when it first came out. I was still in elementary school at the time. I did get into comic books briefly in the 90s and was into DC comic books at the time. And I think I was vaguely aware of Watchmen at the time. I don't remember. But once I found out it was not part of the regular continuity, I wasn't really interested. My view of comic books at the time was you've got a limited amount of money to spend. There are years of back issues that you've got to catch up on. And your goal is to assemble as much of the ongoing story as your limited budget will allow you to. And anything that took place of outside of that continuity, I wasn't interested in. I think I had some friends in college who were interested in this, but I had largely moved on from comic books at that time. I thought I had. As the years would go by, I would periodically get into comic books every few years, but I wasn't reading them in college. And then I didn't. Oh, yes, sorry. One thing I almost forgot. This book again came to my attention in 2005 when it was placed on Time Magazine's 100 Best Novels. So 2005, Time Magazine did a list of the 100 greatest novels. This was the 100 greatest novels of all time, like the 100 greatest novels, full stop. And I believe it was just 3 critics who put it together. But it was treated at the time as, the definitive list. The hype that these lists sometimes get when they're announced by major publications. And Watchmen had a spot on that list as one of the greatest novels of all time. So not one of the greatest comic books of all time, but one of the greatest novels of all time. So I remember a lot of the chatter that generated on blogs at the time. I had a friend who was a fan of Watchmen. He was a comic book geek, a fan of Watchmen, but he said, Watchmen may be great, but it's not one of the 100 greatest novels of all time. He said this is just affirmative action for graphic novels, placing it on a list alongside other proper works of art. And yeah, I think ever since then the question remains: Is this one of the greatest novels of all time, or is it just a pretty good comic book, but not a work of art as compared with a novel? Or is the whole thing overhyped? So I don't know. I will pass the question off to you, dear viewer, but maybe we'll be considering some of these questions as we go along. But I didn't get curious enough to track down and read this thing until the movie came out, or actually the months before the movie came out. So, being a bit of a geek, I used to waste a lot of time on sites like Ain't It Cool News or Bleeding Cool or other sites that would hype up things about geek culture. And there was so much talk about the Watchmen adaptation, and they were talking about the characters and the different character arcs. And I was getting enough little glimpses into the story to make me curious. I had a few things spoiled for me before I tracked down this novel, but what the glimpses I did get of the story intrigued me. So ordered it online, had a copy shipped all the way out to me in Japan, which I don't usually do, but I was, at that time, my curiosity was so piqued that I went through the trouble and expense of shipping it to Japan, where I was teaching English at the time. And even though I was a Johnny-come-lately to this, I was very captivated by it when I read it. And looking back on that, possibly I was captured by the critics. I hate to say it, but I don't really have much of a critical spine of my own. I tend to sway in the direction of the critics. So because there was so much written about how this was the greatest thing ever, I think I approached it expecting to find it as a great work of art, and consequently dug it. All the stuff in here I thought was so deep at the time. In fact, I probably shouldn't be admitting this, but I got so into it that I was dating a Japanese girl at the time, and she would come over to my apartment, and I wanted to share this with her, so I would do my best to translate it into Japanese for her and read it together. The first few pages I was able to do. After that, she told me that she couldn't understand what I was trying to say. I guess my Japanese wasn't up to the stuff in the as the issue went on. But, that's got to be a list of one of the geekiest things I've ever done. But anyways, I've now come back to it for a reread and a re-evaluation. I'm also influenced now by other booktubers. I've watched Steve Donahue's video on Watchmen, the comic, in which I think Steve is of the opinion that it's a bit of a mess with moments of genius in it. I hope I'm summarizing his opinion correctly. I'll link to his video in the description down below, and you can make up your own mind. Also, Michael K. Vaughan, who with Steve was doing the world's finest collaboration on this. Michael K. Vaughan was, I think, of the opinion that it was a masterpiece with some flaws in it. So they both agree that there's genius in here and that there are flaws in here. And I guess it's just a matter of depending which one you want to emphasize, the genius or the flaws. I felt rereading this that I noticed a lot of the flaws this time around. Maybe it was just because I was more receptive to the flaws, or maybe it's because when you're rereading it, you notice a lot of the extra stuff, a lot of the stuff that doesn't really add that much to the story and just seems a little bit of a slog to get through. We'll talk about that more as we go along. Certainly, whatever else you want to say about this, you certainly have to say that this feels like an immersive reading experience. And it's noticeable looking at the panel layout here, where you have 9 panels per page, often, as you can see, with a bit of text in them. Now, they vary that a little bit, but 9 panels per page, or 18 for a double spread like this, is kind of the baseline. Steve Donahue points in his video that Dave Gibbons will open up the real estate sometimes for extra effect and break away from the 9 panels, but the 9 panels is the baseline. And you can get a lot of story on a page when you have 9 panels to play with. I've been reviewing a lot of comic books on this channel, and one thing I've been saying very frequently in those reviews is that it feels like there's an interesting kernel of a story here. I'm talking about other comics I've reviewed now. I'll quite often say in my review of other comics, it feels like there's an interesting kernel of a story there, but that the format of having limited space to develop it in the comic book just meant that you were only getting a little taste of what could have been an interesting story. But this is a reminder of actually the comic book format doesn't have to be limiting. If you take full advantage of a page like this, you can actually get a lot of story in. Now, granted, only some of this is text. You're sacrificing a lot of the panel to a picture. But, of course, you're not really sacrificing it to a picture because that picture is telling the story. So if this was a traditional novel, you would have to describe what the characters looked like and describe what they were doing and describe how they were sitting or something like that. And of course, the picture plus the text is carrying the story just as much as if you were reading a traditional novel. Now, the irony is there may have been too much room to tell this story, because Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons didn't seem to have enough story to fill up this format. There are things in here that Steve Donahue has accused this book of padding. After having reread it, I've got to say I can see where he's coming from. There are elements in here that definitely feel like padding. Alan Moore, according to Wikipedia, said that they had 12 issues to fill. They realized they only had 6 issues of storyline, and they solved that problem by going into the backstory of all these characters. Now, going into the backstory is useful. We'll talk more about this later, hopefully, but it does create more of an immersive feeling of this world and gives more depth to these characters. But it is an indication that they had more space than they knew what to do with, and some of the backstory does feel like it's killing the forward momentum of the current story, but maybe we'll talk more about that later. Okay, the background to Watchmen, and here I'm greatly indebted to stuff I've read off of the internet, mainly Wikipedia. But Alan Moore was working for DC at the time, and he found out that DC had acquired the rights to the Charleston comic book company. Now, this gets into a little bit of comic book history, but nowadays, when you think of superhero comic books, you think of DC and Marvel, because by and large, those are the only 2 superhero comic book companies left standing. But if you go back to the 1940s or the 1960s, there were actually a lot more comic book companies around back in those days, and they just kind of died out one by one. And DC, I'm not sure why Marvel didn't get on the action, but it seems largely to have been a DC thing. DC bought up the rights to a lot of their rival companies. So, for example, the Shazam character, Billy Batson, Captain Marvel, that wasn't originally DC, that was their competitors, Fawcett Comics, but they bought out Fawcett Comics. Quality Comics, which had a lot of Golden Age superheroes, DC bought out. And Charleston Comics, DC bought out. Now, DC at the time had a structure which allowed them to use characters from other comic book continuity. They had a multiverse. I guess both Marvel and DC have multiverses. It's an established thing in comic books. But DC back in those days was making more use of it. So you had different parallel Earths, and if you bought the characters from Fawcett Comics, they were just on a parallel Earth, which was called Earth S or something like that, which Superman could cross over and visit every now and again, but they were out in their own continuity. And same with the characters from Quality Comics. But in 1986, they did away with the multiverse, or at least they thought they were going to do away with it. We don't need to get into the whole convoluted history. They thought they were going to do away with it and have this big Crisis on Infinite Earths event in which all the characters were integrated into the DC universe. And so the characters from the Charleston comic books that ended up getting integrated into the DC universe were Blue Beetle, Captain Atom, and the Question. I think there were some more characters as well, but for our purposes, those are the ones that are going to be important. Now, here's again where this ties in with my own comic book reading history, is when in the 90s, when I was trying to collect back issues of DC Comics, and I was going through the bins to collect the cheap back issues, the ones that you could get for less than $1. I got a lot of issues of Captain Atom from the mid-'80s and Blue Beetle from the mid-'80s. And I had no idea that I remember it being kind of somewhat confusing that, I had never heard of Captain Atom or Blue Beetle before, but the comics were treating them as if they were old superhero legends. And I had no idea that, the reason I never saw them on Super Friends or something like that is because they were from a rival company and only acquired by DC in the 1980s. Anyways, where this ties into Watchmen is Alan Moore, once he found out that DC had acquired the rights to Charleston Comics, wanted to do a murder mystery in which one of the established Charleston Comics characters gets murdered. There's an investigation to find out who the murderer is. And in the course of that investigation, you find out that all these established superheroes from Charleston Comics, which you thought were just icons of virtue, are all just incredibly screwed up individuals with all these weird neuroses and kinks and kind of like a deconstruction of superhero comics, as it were. DC, once they decided that they were going to integrate Charleston Comics into their mainstream universe, told Alan Moore that he couldn't actually treat the characters in such a way. It would make them essentially unmarketable ever since then if he were to do that, and they had just paid a lot of money for these characters. But Alan Moore devised his own version of these characters. So the Question became Rorschach, also based on a couple other characters, but we'll come back to that later. Captain Atom became Dr. Manhattan, and the Blue Beetle became the Night Owl. And Alan Moore was concerned that these new characters, because they were new characters, would not have the same emotional weight as if he was using established nostalgic characters. But as Alan Moore says, he figured a way around that was to spend enough time developing these characters and going into their backstory and creating a world in which there were two generations of superheroes. So it feels, when you first get into comics for the first time, and you start picking up issues and you're becoming aware that there's a larger backstory, that there's years of superhero comic books that you haven't read yet, but you're stepping into a larger story. You get that feeling reading Watchmen. There's enough flashbacks back to the golden age of the 1940s superheroes and flashbacks to the 1960s, and then the story takes place in the 1980s. So you get that illusion of having a much longer established time with these characters. Now, one of the characters that was coming in from Charleston was the Question, who was created by Steve Ditko. And Steve Ditko was an interesting guy. There's a BBC documentary on Steve Ditko, which is available on YouTube, and I'll link it down in the description down below. If you're at all interested in this stuff, I can't recommend it enough. I mean, if you're not interested in comic books, if you're not interested in comic books, you probably stopped watching this video a long time ago. But if you're interested in comic books, you'll just eat this stuff up. It's just a lot of fascinating information about Steve Ditko. So Steve Ditko is a guy who created Doctor Strange, and along with Stan Lee, co-created Spider-Man. He wasn't Stan Lee's usual collaborator. Stan Lee usually collaborated with Jack Kirby, but Steve Ditko was also an artist at Marvel at the time. And Spider-Man is his most famous creation. Stan Lee came up with the idea of Spider-Man, but Steve Ditko is the one who drew him and created the design of Spider-Man. Also, Steve Ditko did all the early issues, and Steve Ditko was not only responsible for creating the aesthetic of Spider-Man, but as the collaboration went on, Steve Ditko got more and more into the plotting. Now, Steve Ditko was a huge Ayn Rand nut. He was big into Ayn Rand's cult of objectivism, that the society isn't going to help you. Society is just a bunch of morons who are trying to prevent you from reaching your full potential, and you have to push through all the morons in society to create your own true potential, just like in an Ayn Rand novel. And so this is where the Spider-Man gets his early aesthetic, where Peter Parker is not being helped by the people around him. He's an outcast in high school. The girls don't like him. The jocks pick on him. The newspaper editor, J. Jonah Jameson, doesn't appreciate him. He doesn't get any help from society. He just gets misery from society, and he reaches his full potential in spite of society. Because Steve Ditko got bigger and bigger into this objectivism rabbit hole, he started having more clashes with Stan Lee and eventually left Marvel Comics altogether, where he went to Charleston Comics, where he created The Question, who Rorschach is partly based on. Although Rorschach is also based on a Steve Ditko character called Mr. A, which was created for a more independent comic book to get outside of the comic code authority, which was regulating comics at the time. And Mr. A was even a more extreme version of the Question character. He was again big into the Ayn Rand cult of objectivism, where you could not blame society for your problems. You had to find the strength within you in spite of society. But not only that, he believed very strongly in a world where there was wrong and right, and there were no gray areas. And this was something he said very overtly. And he had a little calling card where one half would be white and the other half would be penciled in black. And this would represent Mr. A. There's black and there's white and there is nothing in between. And his Mr. A did not have any sympathy for criminals. They had made their choices, and he either, I don't remember if he ever killed any criminals, but he would indirectly cause the death of criminals by refusing to save them. So like if a criminal got knocked over and was hanging from a building ledge or something, Mr. A would not rescue him. He would just wait for the criminal to fall to his death. And so that character is shown in Rorschach, who is Alan Moore's appropriation of Steve Ditko's objectivism philosophy. And in fact, in that documentary I just referenced, there's a brilliant line where Alan Moore is talking about how Steve Ditko was asked about what he thought about Watchmen. And Steve Ditko, I think, initially didn't recognize what Watchmen was, but then somebody talked about the character of Rorschach. And Steve Ditko said, Rorschach, yes, he's just like Mr. A, except he's insane. So that's just a brilliant little story where Steve Ditko recognizes his philosophy in Rorschach, but doesn't seem to recognize that such a character would be perceived as insane by the world, or I don't know. Maybe Alan Moore is creating an unfair caricature of Steve Ditko's philosophy. I've never actually read any of the Mr. A comics myself. I'm just familiar with the BBC documentary. But this is definitely what Alan Moore is going for here. And we get this right from the opening chapter, which is told from Rorschach's perspective, where Rorschach is saying things that would come straight out of Mr. A's mouth or Steve Ditko's mouth. He's looking down at the society, and he's talking about how they're all terrible people who have made their own choices, and they're going to suffer the consequences of their choices, and he feels no obligation to help them. There's a line in here somewhere. Let's see if I can find it. Otherwise, I'll try and quote it from memory. Where he says that someday the world will ask me to help them, and I'll look down and I'll whisper no. They made their choices. So like Steve Ditko, Rorschach believes in a world where there is good and there is bad and there is nothing in between. So what do you do with such a character, or what do you do with such a philosophy? So the obvious thing to do is to put that character into a situation where there is obviously a moral quandary, where there isn't a clear good and a clear bad, and where whatever side of the choice you make, you're going to have some sort of blood on your hands. And that is exactly what happens in the last chapter. Oh, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning, but spoilers. I'm going to be spoiling everything. If you've not, sorry, I forgot to say that at the beginning. Spoilers. Turn the video off now if you've not read the comic. That's exactly what happens at the end. Although, if I have a criticism to make, it's that it happens in a very heavy-handed way. I mean, it's just such an obvious setup for a very... it feels like somebody's playing Ethical Quandaries 101 with you, where they're making up some ridiculous hypothetical that would never happen in real life. That kind of ridiculous hypothetical is what Rorschach ends up with. So I think Alan Moore's idea to take this character and to put him into ethical quandaries to test or to ridicule the objectivism philosophy is an interesting idea, but I think that could have been done subtler. We could have had a story in which there were a whole bunch of little choices where this character was just gradually forced to realize that there is not always a clear-cut difference between right and wrong. But that's not the story we get. We get a very heavy-handed ending where the character has an opportunity to, in the context of this story, save lives by just agreeing to keep quiet about a crime that was committed. And he refuses to do that, and that's the that's his character arc, where we see that the failure of objectivism, or do we? It's left ambiguous who has the moral high ground at the end of this story. So, yeah, uh, that's the character of Rorschach. Um, what else to talk about? Maybe let me take a step back here. Oh, sorry. One more thing before we leave Rorschach. Rorschach is also portrayed as a right-wing nut, and you can see the connection here because Ayn Rand's objectivism is something that's been endorsed by the libertarian wing of conservative American politics, and yet I think it is an open question whether the inability to see morally gray areas is necessarily part of being right wing, or whether that's something that could apply equally as well to zealots on both sides of the political spectrum. But Rorschach is a fan of, reads New Frontiersmen, which is a far right publication. I mean, within the context of this graphic novel, it doesn't exist in real life, but in the world of Watchmen, it's a far right publication, which is run by people who, how best to put this, who have obviously racist views, but are attempting to participate in mainstream political discourse through coded language, in a way that was happening in the 80s, in a way that is still recognizable today. So here's the most blatant example of this. There's a law against superheroes within the context of this story. The newspaper is arguing against that law. Now, some people within the context of this world are pointing out that costume vigilantes are just like the Ku Klux Klan. But they actually defend the Ku Klux Klan. But might I point out that despite what some might view as their later excesses, the Klan originally came into being because decent people had perfectly reasonable fears for the safety of their persons and belongings when forced into proximity with people from a culture far less morally advanced. Now, that is, once you read between the lines and realize what they're actually saying, pretty blatant. Arguably a little bit too blatant. Like maybe Moore was tipping his hand just a little bit too much on that one. But I guess he didn't want you to miss the point. And the point is, they are saying black people are inferior without ever saying the word black, just referring to the culture in a way that is in a way that happens in real life. I mean, this is going to date this video a little bit if I reference something from the headlines, but as I'm recording this video, just a couple days ago, Trump said that immigrants were poisoning American culture. So that's another direct example of being racist without exactly referencing the skin color of somebody, just using coded language that everybody understands exactly what it means. And Rorschach is immersed into this throughout his inner monologue as far as we see it. He references homosexuals and communists as the undesirables, despicables. Alan Moore was never one to shy away from politics, and we we get a view of that with Rorschach. Although arguably he is hitting out at both sides, because there's a left-wing superhero who ends the Veidt character, who ends up with a lot of blood on his hands by the end of this story. This is a little bit of a digression, but a couple years ago, when that there was a TV show that came out. You remember this, the Watchmen TV show? I never saw too many episodes of it. But there were a lot of people on YouTube who were complaining about how the new Watchmen was too woke. You know, these right-wing culture warrior grifters who are complaining about how Hollywood is making everything too woke nowadays. And the Cosmonaut Variety Show channel did an episode on the new Watchmen TV show. And I'll link to it in the description down below. And he said, "What are you guys talking about? Watchmen is too woke?" He said, "Have you ever read the Watchmen graphic novel? It's like the most political thing I've ever read. Why are you complaining that there's politics in Watchmen?" It's like this idea we have, that some people have, that all of the stuff from the past was apolitical. There was no politics in any of the media that we grew up with as kids, until these woke liberals got their hands on it in the last 5 years, and suddenly they're turning it all political, where no politics has existed before, which I think, as the Cosmonaut Variety Show rightly pointed out, was just a very amnesiac reading of the Watchmen story. Okay, so let's move aside from the politics a minute, or actually, sorry, maybe another point on the meta-politics of this world. So, like I said before, this is a deconstruction of this superhero story. Now, before we talk about deconstruction of superhero stories, I guess there's one obvious point where this is not being deconstructed. And that is that in real life, superheroes would not exist. Putting aside, for example, Captain Manhattan, who is gifted with superpowers from a nuclear accident. We'll let that one go. But the rest of them are all just normal human beings who have put on masks and decided to fight crime, you know, like Batman. Now, the reason Batman can't exist in the real world, I think there's a famous quote about this somewhere on the internet. In the real world, Batman would have broken both his knees and would have had spinal problems before he was 30. The human body just can't take that much punishment, as these superheroes are portrayed as engaging in every issue. Again, assuming they're just normal human beings who are putting on masks like the Batman model. As well as the idea that there's one like really great fighter and he can take down a whole room of other people. That's just an adolescent fantasy where, and it is a popular thing for young boys to fantasize about, like, the terrorists take over the school and I save the whole school through my great fighting moves. But in reality, there's the playing field in which humans engage with each other and combat is not so unequal. Maybe you might be able to take down one guy, but you can't take down a whole room full of guys. That's just movie stuff. Now, to be fair, this stuff has a long history. I mean, it goes all the way back to Achilles and Greek mythology and stuff like that. The idea of the one mighty warrior just killing everybody else in the field. But it is just a male fantasy. So there's a part of me, and maybe I'm thinking about this too hard, but there's a part of me that thinks, well, why even bother to dissect the rest of it, the superhero fantasy, when the whole thing is just built on something unrealistic? But leaving that aside, assuming for the moment that we're going to assume that in this world that there are masked crime fighters who are able to become superheroes, then this is a deconstruction of what that world would look like on two levels. One is on the individual level, where these are not just purely altruistic people who put on masks to do good and serve humanity, even though that's what they want you to believe. They all have ulterior motives for getting into this, whether it's sexual kinks in some cases or huge egos. That angle, well, who can argue with that angle? That angle is right on. In the real world, there would not be the kind of altruism that you see in the old school comic books. But the other way would be on the broader political angle. In the old comic books, you would see like Superman fighting against the Nazis, the Marvel comic books, I think, were very political in the 60s. Captain America would fight against the Viet Cong or the communist China, and Iron Man, etc. Was very right wing back in those days. But the status quo of the world would never change, right? You'd have Captain America fighting in Vietnam or Iron Man fighting in Vietnam, but the Vietnam War would still go on as usual. Whereas actually, if you had a big superpower fighting in the war, then maybe that would upset the geopolitical balance of things, and we can explore that. So you have Watchmen. Where is it? In the Watchmen mythology, Captain Manhattan gets sent to Vietnam and ends the Vietnam conflict with his overwhelming power, which is in here somewhere. Sorry, that's the wrong spot. So that's an interesting way to think about this. Although if you wanted to nitpick this, I think you could argue that America was never at a loss for overwhelming military force in Vietnam. We dropped all the bombs on them we could possibly drop. What difference would a Dr. Manhattan have made in real life, even assuming you could have had a Dr. Manhattan? The problem was not lack of, if I want to play devil's advocate on this, the problem was not lack of superior force. The problem was the objective of the war was to remake the society of a country and then go home and expect it to stay just as we remade it. If you wanted to occupy Vietnam as a colony, then America had enough military power to do that. But if you wanted to get Vietnam to form a non-communist government, here we go, Dr. Manhattan in Vietnam. If the objective was to remake Vietnam in America's image, and then just go home and expect it to stay just like we left it, then that was the problem with the whole objective of that war. It's not that we didn't have the firepower. It's just that in order to achieve our objectives, we would just have to stay there forever to make sure that things stayed exactly like we wanted it to. Sorry, that's a little bit of a political side rant. But I'm willing to let that go to a certain extent because I see what he's doing. He's saying, okay, if we really have these superpower human beings, then let's see how that would play out. And it creates an imbalance where Dr. Manhattan creates a world where the American firepower is superior to the Russians. The Russians don't dare do anything because Dr. Manhattan can stop any nuclear launch from the Russians, and it gives the Americans a permanent advantage, or at least what the Americans think is a permanent advantage, before Dr. Manhattan decides to leave Earth and go to Mars, and then that sets off the countdown to nuclear war as Russia invades Afghanistan. So remember, this is in the 1980s when it was Russia invading Afghanistan instead of the U.S. And the U.S. Tells them to stop, and we go into nuclear crisis mode. And there are some, also within the context of the Watchmen. Sorry, I'm flipping back and forth trying to find the places I'm looking for in the comics. Nixon keeps getting elected for several terms because the superheroes, one of the right-wing superheroes, is able to do away with the journalists who would have exposed him in real life in our world. And so in the world of Nixon and the world of Watchmen, there's no one to expose Nixon's crimes, and so he keeps getting elected. And he also wins the Vietnam War, so that makes him popular. But shoot, I can't find the pages I'm looking for here, but I can remember them. With Dr. Manhattan gone and the Russians invading Afghanistan, it moves us into a countdown into nuclear war, in which Nixon and Kissinger and the rest of them is filled with name droppings from the Nixon administration, decide that here it is. Decide that their best option, if there's going to be a nuclear war, they have to strike first. So here they are running the projections of what the nuclear war would look like. So Nixon says, and would our losses be acceptable? I'm running a program now with that, which assumes that we've knocked out the Eastern Bloc, that a percentage of their warheads were already en route. There we are. Britain down, Germany down. Well, I've seen worse scenarios. And so they decide that the East Coast would become completely uninhabitable, but they'd be able to preserve the West Coast depending on the wind. And they are obviously reluctant, losing the East Coast. We need to, I don't know. So they're thinking about it, but they're thinking about it. It's an indictment of the way these politicians treat the world, as it is if it's their chess game. Like, never mind all the people that would be wiped out. It's just, okay, are these acceptable losses? Can we come through in the end? And that is, maybe I'm showing my own political bias here a little bit, but I think that's a charge that could be made against the Nixon-Kissinger administration, is they did tend to not think about the human costs of their policies, as they are portrayed in showing in this graphic novel here. So, like I said, works on a few different ways of deconstructing the ways these heroes might play out in the real world. All right, now maybe before I run out of time on this video, talk about some of the flaws I noticed in this book. It's brutal. There's a lot of, Steve Donahue mentioned this in his video. I certainly noticed it rereading it. I had forgotten how much discomforting stuff there was in here. Children getting murdered, dogs getting hacked to death, women getting brutally beaten up. Some of it is shown, some of it is alluded to. It's just a brutal story. And I'm sure defenders of the story would argue that it needs to be that brutal in order to achieve the impact. I don't know, maybe it does, but certainly I can say that those discomforting elements in it decreased my enjoyment of reading this. And that's partly me. On my reading rotation, I have my more serious books, and I have the comic books, and I try and keep both of them. Keep my reading both of them at the same time throughout the week. The more serious books maybe during the afternoon, maybe the comic books to relax with at night. And if you're reading a comic book to relax with at night, and then you get hit with all this really brutal stuff in the story, you're like, I'm not in the mood to read this right now. And I think perhaps the medium of a comic encourages a more relaxed reading, which I don't know. What do you guys think? I know I'm on the verge of saying that a comic book has certain limitations in the types of stories it lends itself to, which people are going to disagree with, right? But I feel like the way when my brain is engaged with these colorful pictures, I don't want to be confronted with all this graphic stuff, this brutal stuff. Maybe if I'd been reading this in the afternoon instead of to unwind in the evening, it would have been different. Let me know what you think. There is also, as Steve Donahue mentioned in his videos, some of what is arguably misogyny in here. There's a scene, I'm not going to show it on my camera, or at least I'm not going to linger on it. But you'll know exactly what I'm talking about if you've read this, in which the Silk Spectre is attempted rape and she's brutally beat up. And whenever you're portraying this, there's always a question of with what intent are you portraying this? Are you portraying this because you want the audience to feel repulsed at this, and you want this to you want the audience to feel repulsion at these characters, and this is just the only way you're able to get at this emotion? And is that legitimate, or is there another reason it's being portrayed? It's some uncomfortable pages, I think, no matter how you look at it. Then, as I talked about before, there is arguably a lot of padding in here. I certainly noticed on my reread that parts of this were a bit of a slog to get through. And maybe this is because I was rereading it, and I'd read it before, I knew where it was going. I wasn't getting a lot out of the reread. But yeah, even though I recognize that this is part of the world building of the comic, it can be a little bit slow paced at times. And speaking of padding and slow pacing, there is the story within a story, which is integrated throughout this, about the Black Freighter, which is within the world of this story. There's a kid who's sitting at the newsstand reading a comic, and it will intercut the panels from the comic with the main story. In a way that is confusing when you're reading it. Now, I don't know, maybe having a little bit of challenge in my reading material isn't such a bad thing. Keeps me on my toes, sharpens my mind up a little bit. I don't know. But you'll be reading like this panel from the main story, and then you'll have this, which is referring to the story within a story. And then this panel from this quotation, this dialogue is from the main story. This is from the story within a story. And as I'm reading through this panel, as I'm reading through these panels, I have to constantly be shifting my brain back and forth. Okay, which story am I reading? What's going on? Oh no, I'm back to the main story. I'm back to the side story. Back to the main story. Back to the side story. In a way that I think if you're anything like me, you have to read it more than once, or you have to constantly stop and reorient yourself all the time. Is it really clever or is it really annoying? Steve Donahue said in his video that he thinks the whole thing is just pure filler. Alan Moore wanted to write a story about pirates, so he found a way to sneak this in, even though it has nothing to do with the main story. The argument against that is that it's meant to be symbolism. What happens in the pirate story is symbolizing the themes in the main story. In fact, somebody pointed that out to Steve in the comments of his video. And Steve acknowledged the comment but dismissed it. He said, no, I think I've read this a few times. I think I was right the first time, was the gist of his response. On my reread, I think that the symbolism comes through very nicely and very neatly in the penultimate issue, issue number 11, where we see a very clear parallelism between Vaight's master plan to save humanity and what's going on with the protagonist of the Black Freight story, where he realizes that his attempt to save the people in his town has actually ended up in him causing more harm than good. And the dialogue parallels each other quite nicely here in a way that I think works quite neatly for that penultimate issue. Everything leading up to it works less neatly. And all the details we get about the Black Freighter and being marooned and being on the raft and eating the seagull and just the long journey on the ocean and with the shark never ending. I don't see how that's contributing to the story at all. That definitely feels like padding to me. I don't know, make a case to me in the comments section if you like. How the stuff in the Black Freighter is actually adding more symbolism to the stuff that's going on in the main comic. I'm willing to grant it for issue 11, but I don't think at the moment I'm willing to grant it for any of the issues that come before. For all that, it seems to me to be just padding. And then, I'm going to wrap this up soon, I promise. There's the ending. Both Michael K. Vaughan and Steve Donahue in their videos talk about their disappointment with the ending. And both of them are coming from the perspectives of people who were buying this off the newsstand at the time it came out. So sorry, this is one of those little details I should have made clear at the beginning of the video. But Watchmen was originally released on the comic book newsstands as a series of 12 different issues, which would come out, I think they were scheduled for once a month, but then they had production delays. But yeah, 12 issues which were supposed to be released monthly. And they talk about how it was building up and up and up, and then they were hoping for a great climax, and then they thought that the ending was ridiculous. I'm not going to go into details here. If you've read it already, you know exactly what I'm talking about. My perspective as somebody whose first time encountering this was in the collected graphic novel edition, my perspective may have been different because I didn't have to wait every month for the issue to come out. But I thought the ending worked. Now, the ending was, of course, changed for the movie. And, okay, for the movie, the giant squid monster would have looked a little bit ridiculous on the big screen. Fair enough. I think it works in the context of the comic book. I also think it works insofar as this is obviously the conclusion to the story that has been building up so far. All the details fit in. Now, you can point out, as I pointed out earlier in the video, that this is a very heavy-handed moral quandary. we could have maybe explored some of the philosophical issues inherent in the different political philosophies of these characters with something a little bit less heavy-handed. But that would have been a different story. That would not have been the conclusion to the story that Alan Moore was setting up here. Everything works out to the conclusion of this story. And putting aside the fact that the ending is a little bit heavy-handed, I think the ending works as a catalyst for the dramatic confrontation between these characters, where Night Owl and Rorschach are finally confronting Veidt, and when Dr. Manhattan finally confronts Veidt, after several issues where it felt like this story was not moving forward at all, where we were getting mired in the backstories of these characters and mired in the whole Black Freighter story within a story thing, all of a sudden it feels like things are moving. It feels like things have dramatic weight. It feels like the characters' dialogue to each other, I think, works very well. I think there's some great dialogue here, some classic lines. I thought that the ending came through, and I know. It's fashionable nowadays to hate on the ending. I thought it worked. Let me know in the comments why I'm wrong. Okay. There is a lot more to talk about, isn't there? I haven't touched on half of the symbolism or stuff in here, but I think you will agree I have talked long enough, and whatever I haven't covered in this video, somebody else has got covered, because certainly no comic has been analyzed more than Watchmen. So we will finish things off here. Thank you for sticking with me.